Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Real Life Theology podcast. This is your host, Reagan Gibbs. Today's episode is going to help us explore the significance of embracing a theological approach to ministry over a utilitarian mindset, fostering a deeper connection with God and all of the individuals we serve. So let's get right into it.
Well, the description of this session was that the theologian Christos Janaras, a Serbian Orthodox theologian, he declares that the Western culture that we are a part of rests on the foundation, historically speaking, of seeking truth as the highest goal. It's like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. Sounds like what we're all for. But the interesting thing is, this is true historically, and he notes that we can see this in both pre-Christian and Christian eras, from Aristotle to Augustine. But he makes an interesting point that today, that's actually not the primary pursuit of the general kind of population. In other words, if you think about what are people really aiming for right now, it's becoming more apparent that we're not all seeking truth. So he names what he thinks that generally what people are seeking in the Western culture today: utility. How has that truth, that people are not really seeking truth, but utility, how has that affected our churches? How has it affected our lives and the kind of persons we're becoming? That's really what I want to get at. And I believe that the impact of this approach to life, also ministry, has made a significant impact on our lives and our churches. So what I want to do is advocate for embracing theology, which is really the highest form of truth, and not utility for our life and our ministry. So I want to inspire and instruct on this topic and unpack how a theological approach stemming from the very person of God, as opposed to a pragmatic first approach to ministry, can breathe life into what you do. So a little background on me. I'm a book publisher. I own Hymn Publications. So I'm trained for ministry from Ozark Christian College out in Joplin, Missouri. I went to Asbury Theological Seminary for more Bible education, as if I didn't get enough from Ozark. And I'm actually studying at Aberdeen right now. I'm getting a master's in historical theology. I'm just a glutton for theological punishment, I guess. In case you're wondering, what do I do in ministry besides publish discipleship books? I preach 6 times a year at my home church in Franklin, Tennessee, Harpeth Christian Church. And I teach probably 15 or 20 times. We have an in-house ordination and leadership training program. So I run our teaching ministry, where we train the next generation of church leaders from within. So I just want to give you a little bit of background for who you're listening to. So here's what I want to say positively about what is going on with the church today. I think we excel as a church, capital C church, in our context in America at growth. I think we've got good systems, we've got tools and programs and services. We know how to grow things. I mean, look at how we were founded, right? The entrepreneurial spirit really pervades the church, and that can be a really good thing. We can make things go, we can get stuff done. So if you think about the last 30 years of church in America, we've seen quite a few phases and impetuses, kind of new waves of how to do church. You remember in the early 90s, the seeker-sensitive church started to kind of be a popular thing. Andy Stanley and a lot of churches wanted to be sensitive to people seeking. And then it kind of morphed from that. It's more extended into the purpose-driven model with Rick Warren, especially in the late 90s. And the late 90s really saw the boom of restoration movement church planting. We were the fastest growing, I'll say, non-denominational denomination in America at the time. Our church, Harpeth Christian Church, was planted in the 90s, 1997. We were a part of that. But then it was simple church in the early 2000s. Just Sunday, service, small groups, okay? And look, there's merit to that, right? It worked. I thought it was helpful. There was a book about simple church. It was clarifying. But then as we got towards the 2010s, then we started thinking about, multi-site and micro churches and mega churches. And really we've seen mega churches go from just a handful in the latter half of the last century to now there's an incredible amount of mega churches, not only in North America, but around the world. And now what I've really kind of seen is kind of again, there's merit to all this. There's the relational discipleship approach. How many people are familiar with that kind of language? Relational discipleship. And I think there's merit to that. I spent 3 months in northern Idaho at Post Falls at Real Life Ministries with Jim Putman and his church. How many people have read Real Life Discipleship? They champion, it's not just about this or that. It's let's be in relationship. And I think that was needed. I think it is needed. All these things have merit. But they can become part of what I would call the lowest common denominator, which is a utilitarian approach to ministry. So a lot of times, especially at conferences, it's like, what's the new thing? What's the new program, the new system, the new tool, the new... But the problem is, let's take a step back at what are we even doing in finding these things that we can use? So another way to think about a utility is anything, event, or person that you can use as a tool. And so there's this approach to ministry that I just haven't seen much of. And I want to turn the volume up on this approach. And so what I'm talking about is I want to address what is your true north as a minister of the gospel? What's your true north as a person? Have you been tempted and allured into a utilitarian approach to ministry without knowing it? Do you feel a burden when you meet with people to get them to do the thing that you need them to do for your ministry to succeed? Do you feel like you've got to make the call to action and enroll people into the system? And so what I want to do is relieve you of that pressure that is undue. And I want to refresh you with a vision of God, who is really the subject of theology. So I don't want to offer a new pragmatic approach, but I want to articulate with you a theological approach to ministry. And so the focus of this approach is on truth and not utility. And the highest truth is theology. In fact, it used to be the capstone of a liberal arts education. If you could master the languages and if you could master mathematics and astronomy and culture and history, then you could be a theologian. But now we've actually said theologians are kind of chopped liver. It's like, that's what you can do if you don't have a real career. You do theology. We've lost the appreciation for what theology really is, which is the highest form of the pursuit of truth. And so I'm calling this a theological approach to ministry because it's really the highest way we could think about ministry. I'm not saying my theological approach is the highest. I'm saying a theological approach is the highest form of thinking about ministry. And so what I don't mean is is an academic-only kind of approach to ministry. I'm not trying to say we all need to become ivory tower theologians. And I don't mean some sort of ethereal, up in the clouds with no feet on the ground kind of ministry. I'm not talking about that kind of theology. I mean a person-based approach to ministry, and the primary person that we need to talk about is God. We tend to think about God as an idea. We're actually on the wrong foot from the beginning. And so, theology, as we know, comes from theos, right? And so that just means God, right? And so I want to put God back at the center of our ministry. I'm not saying that you don't do that. I'm just trying to refresh our memory on that. I'm trying to turn up the volume on that. So you could call this a theos approach to ministry, if that helps you remember the person of theology. And so, Jesus even calls himself, if we're pursuing the truth, Jesus says, I am the truth. And so when we study theology, we're really studying the person of God and his Son and the Holy Spirit. So, what's your primary goal in ministry? How do you measure success? And so I just want to add to the conversation this notion of a theological scorecard. Okay, so what do they say? Sometimes you kind of measure ministry by buildings, bucks, and what's the other one? Butts, yeah. Right? So we know that. This is kind of how we measure stuff. But what about persons? What if you measured your ministry based on a different scorecard? It's my suspicion that we will know we have been successful in the end when we've truly connected persons to the person of God in a personal way. So there was a while where I'd be, so I run a book publishing company, but every now and then I get out of the house and I get to go meet with people. It's great. So for a while there, I'd be going to like my meeting for the week, and I'd be like, great, I'm going to meet a person. What do I get to do with them? Calm down, Chad. So I'd be driving, I'd just say, Lord, what do you want of me in this meeting? What do you want me to say? What do you want me to do? What do you want of this? It's my meeting of the week. I don't want to ruin it. And I kept hearing again and again, love them. I'd be going to meet with a friend, or it'd be more of a ministry situation, some people I'm discipling or whatever. I kept hearing, love them. Okay. So I started catching on, and the conversation just became a lot quicker. I'd say, what do you want, love? Okay. All right. We're there. But what that didn't mean was to come with my agenda to get them to do what I wanted them to do for my ministry. It didn't mean I set the agenda completely aside and didn't get anything done. It's not that we didn't go anywhere. It's that my approach was seeing them as a person whom I could love based on who they were, not what they could do for me. It seeps in so insidiously into our hearts because we're so saturated in this American, and I mean, America's a great country, but we have our issues, okay? And it can seep inside our ministries, and I'm afraid that it really has. So what does it mean to really love someone? It means to be for them as a person, not just what they can do. I remember I've been thinking a lot about my grandmother recently. So she died last week on Friday. We've been anticipating this literally for like 10 years. She is a fighter. She could water ski at the age of 60. So she just like really knows how to cling on to things. But she finally passed away on Friday, April 26th, last week. And I wrote a letter to her after she died to process her passing. And I realized that she had loved me so well. And I just always felt so loved by her. I remember as a little kid, I'd come into the foyer of her house in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, where we lived at the time. And she would just squeeze me. And I'd be like, oh, you know. I could feel her love literally inside my chest, about to burst. That's what I'm talking about, is truly loving a person for their sake. And it starts with seeing them as such. We treasure our children, don't we? When we give, when our wives, or if you're the wife, when you give birth to your children, you're not thinking, oh, how much we're going to accomplish, No, you're like, this treasured gift. And that's what I'm talking about, is to see each person as made in the image of God. So what does this stand in contrast to? I think it's important. What I'm not talking about, sort of what I want to fight against, is our tendency to have a pragmatic first approach to ministry. And so if there was a tagline for the pragmatic approach to ministry, a utilitarian view of what we're called to do, the tagline would be, if it works. Have you ever noticed, it's like, should we keep on doing this thing on Sunday mornings? Well, it worked, so... Well, what do you think we should do for the youth ministry? What's going to get more people here? What's going to work? You can identify a utilitarian ministry when the primary lens through which you make decisions is by answering the question, does it work? And if that is either explicitly or implicitly how you make decisions for your ministry, I think it's important to just acknowledge that you may have a utilitarian approach to ministry. If it works. So I was in speech class in 10th grade in Franklin, Tennessee. And Mr. Heidi was our speech teacher. And we all got to get up and do like a 3-minute speech on whatever we wanted. Remember this guy got up and talked about marijuana. It's like, and then we got to have like a debate about it. It was great. So I went to a public school. Although after I graduated Bible college, people wondered if I had gone to a public school or not. It was our Christian college, man. After he gave the speech, there was an ethical debate about the use of marijuana. This is like 20 years ago. And I remember everyone was like, well, God created it, so it must be something we can use without question. It's like, and I remember saying, well, just because God created something doesn't mean we should use it or abuse it. And I think that's a really kind of almost a funny way to talk about ministry. Just because it works doesn't mean you should do it. What kind of logic is that? And I actually, that was the end of the argument in high school. I remember being like, wow, that was powerful. It was so simple. Just because you can, or just because it works, doesn't mean you should de facto. So underneath the models that I've mentioned above, seeker-sensitive, purpose-driven, simple, micro, mega, multi, when did growth and progress become the goal? When did it happen? So you've got this whole tradition of monks and nuns throughout the millennia. And they are definitely and definitively not numbers oriented. Has anyone ever been to a monastery or a convent? You don't get the vibe that they're trying to use you for anything. It's more of like, could you get out of my way so that I can meditate? That's an extreme example of a non-utilitarian approach to ministry. They're anchored in truth, virtue, and the disciplines. I'm not saying we should all become monks or nuns, okay? But I'm saying maybe there's something to learn about a virtue-driven ministry. Leo Tolstoy, in his book War and Peace, talks about how life has become about particles and progress. And he wasn't saying that as a compliment. I would say it's probably, I'm not a modern historian, but I would say it's probably that the origins of a utilitarian approach to ministry was with the rise of the Industrial Revolution, where we could get a lot more done. And I believe that it's become part of our ecclesiology, our study of the church, our understanding of how the church should work, with a certain view that the church should make progress and it should be really efficient. So for us, it's a little disturbing when I hear people talk about winning souls. Okay. The most disturbing term is, oh yeah, and we had X number of salvations. What we've done is we've partitioned the person into their salvation moment, and then we chalk it up to our credit. And I think that it can be contemptible. I'm not saying it is when we use those terms. I'm just saying we have, through our language, even separated the person from their salvation. And we objectify them by calling them salvations or winning souls. It's like, is that terminology scriptural? I mean, really? I don't recall. I've spent 6.5 years studying the Bible, and I just don't recall that in Scripture. And I just wonder if that's a product of our ecclesial misinformation. To get a little bit more intense, I think we've taken economic capitalism and we've turned it into ecclesial capitalism. So look, I'm an economic capitalist. I run a business, and it is a for-profit business. But I don't think that it's good to mix in this way economics with ecclesiology. We've turned people into the numbers of measuring our success as churches when we're at our worst. Look, numbers can be people, but is that how we see it? I think there's a place to count. How many people were in attendance? Like, when you arrived in this room, we were all here, I counted. There's not a problem counting. But when the numbers are only numbers, that's a problem. And that balance can be difficult. So I'm saying, what's your primary approach and metric? So it's actually, I'm calling a higher level. I'm not saying do away with that. I'm saying, no, there's a higher level, which is taking the numbers and turning them into people, which in business terminology is not scalable in the most exponential sense. Okay, so if exponential growth is our goal, persons will get left in the dust. But if people and persons are our goal, it might lead to exponential growth. It might not. But at least we're not running over people in the process. So I think in the danger of becoming ecclesial capitalists, where it's not money and dollar signs that we're for, but we're for the butts in the seat. When that becomes our metric, we're just as bad as the worst of them, I would say. When that's like our goal. It just doesn't really look good on us. Because the difference between people and pennies is strong. So I see an underlining issue with a lot of approaches to ministry. And look, I'm not saying they're all bad. I think there's a lot of good for tools, but they're just tools. And when we're driven by that, I think that we miss something. And so to summarize it, the utilitarian approach to ministry is when we use people, events, or situations as tools. So it's, for example, when you're greeting someone who comes to your church for the first time, or your youth group, or whatever, and your first thought is, how can I get them to do something? Instead of, I love this person, where are they at, and what do they need? In business, it would be I've got a product to sell you versus what do they actually need? The worst is when a salesperson has something, their agenda to force on you no matter what you need. I just upped my life insurance term policy, okay? And I'm getting a disability policy. I believe I need those. What I don't need is someone selling me on what I don't need, okay? But salespeople do it all the time, and you know who the worst salespeople are? Those people. You know who the best ones are? What do you need? What do you want? And sometimes what people want isn't what they need. And another way to love someone is to help them know what they really need. So in ministry, we get the opportunity not to sell something, a program, a tool, a system, an approach. What we get to deliver to them is a personal approach for a person to a person. That's the goal. And if it's not time for them to get in a small group, to be baptized, to whatever, love says, I'm going to approach this from a personal standpoint, and I'm going to love you. That's what I'm talking about. I remember being on a mission trip in Globe, Arizona. And we were there to help the Navajo Indians, I think. Is that right? Yeah, that sounds right. So we helped like build a house or something. But then there was one night where we like went down to the downtown area, and it was actually it was Passion Week. Okay, so it was Easter Sunday was coming up, and I remember walking down the strip. It was like a Friday night, and I literally saw a man, looked like he was nailed to a cross with a crown of thorns, and like it looked like blood coming down. And there was another dude dressed as Pontius Pilate. I mean, Friday night, like downtown Globe, Arizona. Might have been Mesa, Arizona. And I remember thinking, like, these guys are hardcore. They are acting out the passion. And I was like, okay, and then we kind of had to walk by this moment on the street. And there was this guy in like a nice sweater. He came up to me and he like intercepted me walking past, and he said, son, if you died tonight, would you go to heaven? And I told him, yes, sir, I would. Thank you very much. And I kept walking, and I had such a nasty taste in my mouth for how that hit me. Because I think what he was trying to do was to win another soul, but he couldn't see me as a person, and it looked really ugly on him. And it looked ugly on us as Christians. That's the kind of thing that I want us to turn the volume down on, and maybe all the way off. Instead, what I want to do is advocate for a personal approach to ministry. So here's what I mean by that. On Judgment Day, the day that man asked me about, that he also will face, this is really the question. In Matthew 7:21, Jesus says, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name drive out demons and perform many miracles and preach many sermons and invite many people and plug them into home groups? Then I will tell them plainly, I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers. It's a very interesting response to a utilitarian minister who had done a lot of things and impacted a lot of people in miraculous ways. And an elder of mine, when I was younger, said, I often wonder where the emphasis was in Jesus' tone when he said that. I never knew you. I never knew you. I never knew you. I think part of the problem with a utilitarian approach to ministry is that maybe we as ministers have objectified ourselves and have not been known by God or other people ourselves. And I wonder if people like that, and I've been there, if they don't reckon with a personal approach to ministry, will hear those terrible words on that day. And I wonder if none of it counts unless it is a personal approach to ministry. Seems pretty clear that it won't. Away from me, you evildoers, I never knew you. It will be shocking to them. And Jesus says, there will be many. What I'm advocating for is actually really important. It's not just some kind of cool session we can do. This is really important stuff for us as ministers. And so, like I said, there's a place to count people. But I'm convinced that the best scorecard, the highest form of ministry, comes when we measure success based on truly connecting persons to the person of God in a personal way. So I want to advocate for an alternative approach called the personalization of ministry. And this comes first from understanding God as a person, not merely as an idea, tool, or dispenser of gifts. And so Martin Buber is a Jewish theologian and philosopher who wrote an important book that I recommend to everybody called I and Thou. Has anyone read this book? Okay. So I and Thou, it is kind of heady and hard to understand. When I read it 10 years ago, I remember thinking, I think I understood his main point. So let me describe this just in kind of the terms of the title of the book. So it's like, Chad, shouldn't we change that title to I and you, which is what thou means? So it's, thou is what, between the 15th to late 17th centuries, people would call you. We say you now, but they said thou. When they were talking about you as the subject, okay? So in early modern English, thou was used, you think about the King James Version or William Shakespeare. So Martin Buber talked about I and thou. And he was talking about the same thing that is the topic for our conversation today. And what it's in contrast to is an I-it relationship. Okay? An I-it relationship is when we relate to people, objects, or things as just that, objects. So whenever I make a person into an it, I have an I-it relationship with them, okay? But an I-thou relationship is when I have a relationship with you that treats you as a person, as a subject. So we don't use like cases with English anymore, but this is what's called the subjective form of you. Okay? So you like when someone's a subject of a sentence, okay? They're the person doing the acting. They have the agency. So for example, thou used as a subject would be, thou art the finest poet of your time, thy time. Thou is the subject. But if the you was an object in the sentence, it would be, I shall give thee all my books, okay? I shall give you all my books. So thee would be the same thing. So I'm just trying to contrast. The would be an objective, okay, form of the word you. Okay, so it's like, what are you talking about? Just think, subject has agency. They're a person. Object can be objectified, okay? And I'm bringing this up partially to just say it's not like this stuff is my idea. Like this is written 100 years ago, okay? I think it was actually 1923 or something like that. So our goal is to have an I-thou relationship with people, as opposed to an I-it relationship. So an I-it relationship would be when we take someone as a person and we turn them into an object of our ministry. So you can do ministry with someone, or you can like minister at them. Okay, think of that as like you kind of do it to them. It's like I baptize. You ever see Nacho Libre? I baptize you. It's like they didn't choose that. You just like forced them into the. It's a funny scene. You should look it up. That would be using them, right? That would be objectifying the person, as opposed to inviting them to make decisions and to have agency in it. So our goal, and this is like really important for me in my discipleship journey, is part of the reason I'm preaching to the choir here. I want to make people holy. Like I'm like, well, you just, I've got 3 kids under the age of 6, and I'm like, will you be holy already? They're still peeing in their pants, It's like, this is a long journey. So, but when we operate with someone as a person, it takes longer because we're not forcing them. So we can objectify all sorts of things, right? We objectify our food when we eat it. It's like, this is a tool for my body to eat and have energy. Right? We use a shovel as a tool. You wouldn't want to have really an I-thou relationship with your burger at lunch today, It's an object that you consume. The problem comes when we treat subjects as objects to consume and to use. So, at worst, think about how men will use women as objects, as sexual objects, through pornography or prostitution. That's probably the worst form of objectification. The converse, or the opposite, is when a man loves a woman and respects her as a person, doesn't use her, but loves her, which includes the same act as if he had hired a prostitute, but it's embedded in a long-term, mutually beneficial, non-abusive relationship called marriage. That's the kind of thing that I'm talking about. And it's a lot of times we accuse men in the prostitute relationship, and rightly so. But I think women can choose to be used and objectified, and they play into it. I'm not saying all of them do. I'm saying I think they can. And so we can enable that. So we do not want to use people in ministry. It's disgusting on a physical level, and it's disgusting on a spiritual level. And so how does this happen? It's when we divide people. And when we see them for only a part of who they are. So Buber talks about you can treat a tree. This might be a little confusing because of what I've said before, but you could treat a tree as an object or as a thou. When you see a tree, for example, for its use or maybe its beauty, like the leaves are really beautiful, or I can use it for firewood, you're objectifying that tree. But if you see the tree as a whole, you're subjectifying it. You're respecting it as a whole. So think about the real problem with prostitution is because a man sees a woman for what she can do for him in a very limited sense and only part of her person. Whereas a man who loves a woman and marries a woman and is respectable doesn't use them, but loves them and receives reciprocally that loving relationship. So the real problem is dividing a person into their constituent parts. That's when we have objectified them. Is this making sense? Okay. We can do this to God. So it's like, well, practically speaking, Chad, what are you saying? Like, how do we work this out? The first I would say is it's probably because we're objectifying God for what he can do for us and not seeing him as a person. Marcion, the 2nd century heretic, said that there were actually two gods. There's the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament. Not just kind of, like he actually said they're two different gods. Well, that's to divide God, because we know that he's one and the same. The early Gnostics divided God, who is one, into 30. They called it the pleroma. We read about this in places like Irenaeus' Against the Heresies. But we know from Deuteronomy 6 and many other places that the Lord our God, the Lord is one. So really the problem with heresy, at least the Gnostic heresy, is dividing God, which is a form of objectifying him. We turn God into what we can use him for. We can use God for ecclesial capitalism. We can preach God to grow our church. We can use theology even to increase our influence. And we've objectified people, I'm afraid, oftentimes when we've used God. So in other words, what we do comes from who we know God to be. We can also divide Christ. So we can divide God, we can divide God's Son. And this, in fact, was also heretical and a major issue for the early half millennia, at least, of the church, was actually the problem of dividing the Son. And some of the early Gnostics, I'm studying the early church, really the 2nd and 3rd century church right now. The early Gnostics said, well, the Logos, before Jesus was born from Mary, was a different God, and Jesus was another God, and then when he was baptized, he became the Christ, which was another God, but he was impassible, and so he didn't suffer, and you get into all this weird, where they're really just dividing the Son. It says this in Against Heresies, book 3, 16:5. It says, as John the disciple of the Lord verifies, saying, but these are written that ye may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing ye might have eternal life in his name. Foreseeing these blasphemous systems, okay, so he's talking about how John wrote, foreseeing the systems of the early Gnostics. He said, John foresaw these systems which divided the Lord as far as lies in their power, saying that he has formed of two different substances. In other words, there's the divine Jesus, and then there's the human Jesus, and they're different persons. But Jesus is one and the same, we know. So we can divide God, we can divide the Son of God, and we can divide ourselves into constituent parts. Do you see how macro level this is? This is not a little part of theology. This is very core. To the Lord our God, the Lord is one. What I'm really calling us to is the Shema. And so don't we skip over, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, and we skip right to, therefore love the Lord your God with all your heart. What if our love of God is only possible when we see God as a person in his singularity, who calls us into his singularity of loving him with all of our person? This is really important stuff. So, in order to recover a theological approach to ministry, we need to recover a view of the theos, God, his son, the huios, for those who have taken Greek, and people, anthropos, the person. Against Heresies, Book 4, 33:7 says, "He shall also judge those who give rise to schisms, who are destitute of the love of God, and who look to their own special advantage rather than the unity of the church." I didn't write that. This was written in the mid to late 2nd century. "And who for trifling reasons, or any kind of reason which occurs to them, cut in pieces and divide the great and glorious body of Christ," talking about the church, "and so far as in them lies, destroy it. Men who prate of peace while they give rise to war, and do in truth strain out the gnat, but swallow the camel. For no reformation of so great importance can be effected by them as will compensate for the mischief arising from their schism." They were dividing the church because they divided God, and they themselves were divided. And it didn't work. And my greatest fear is that all of these systems that have some merit in the modern church, all of our approaches, just might not work, even though that's the point of creating some of the systems. So what I'm advocating for is actually, through the back door, something that does work. How did the earliest church grow? Not because of their systems. It's because of their martyrs who were dedicated to the truth. They had a robust theological approach to ministry. Not the ivory tower kind of ministry, but a robust view of God as a person. They were undivided, and they were wholly united, despite some schismatics and heretics, yes. But by and large, the early church was so successful, so exponentially effective, because of who they were and who they saw as the center of their life. So fundamentally, ministry is not about utility. It's about you. A ministry of I's and thou's. And fundamentally, ministry must be about connecting persons to a person in a personal way. We see this in Exodus 3. Who are you? I am what I am. That starts with I. And did you know that the great leader of the civil rights movement wrote his dissertation on the personalism of God? Martin Luther King Jr. was so effective at reconciling people together, not a perfect man, but because he saw God as a person, he could see other people as persons. And we're created in the image of God, Genesis 1. So we need to see God as a thou. We need to see us as a thou. And we need to see them, the people with whom we do ministry, as a thou. Matthew 25 kind of closes the loop on Matthew chapter 7. It says, "Then he will say to those on his left, 'Depart from me, you who are cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me nothing to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you did not invite me in. I needed clothes, and you did not clothe me. And I was sick and in prison, and you did not look after me.' And they will say, 'When did we see you hungry? When did we see you a stranger or needing clothes or sick?' And he said, 'Whatever you did not do for the least of these, you did not do for me.'" Our ministry to them, when it's not personal, will divide us from Christ eternally if we don't get this figured out. He will reply, I tell you the truth, whatever you did not do for the least of these, you did not. When we look at people primarily for how useful they can be and not as those who bear the image of God, when we can't see the person of Christ in the person of those to whom and with whom we are ministering, we're going to miss it. I did ministry in Nashville for 2 years working with refugees, and I was really tempted to see them as objects of my philanthropy. That time was so sweet. You know why? Because I saw who they were. When I went to go help them set up a Christmas tree, and the 6 children were crawling all over me, and we had an incredible time. You know who was changed more than anyone else? It was me. Because I got to see them as persons and not just people I could bestow my graces upon. They ministered to me. And when I went to see my friend Ron Cawthorn on death row for about 8 years so I could go do ministry for him, you know what happened to me? He ministered to me. Because in him, who was a believer in Jesus, I saw the person of Christ, and Christ ministered to me. Because we were able to just be human beings. Even though he bore the number 120258 on death row, he was Ron Cawthorn after not too long. He became not a prisoner, but a person to me. And in that exchange, I became a person as well. Utilitarian ministry happens when we take the person out of personal evangelism, when we take the disciple out of discipleship. We've abstracted it to the point of industrialization of the process. And we've systematized sometimes, to our detriment, even relationships. And people feel it. So if we take this theological approach to ministry, I'll tell you, it'll work. Maybe not in the timing that you want or that your board needs to hear about, but it'll work. And you will hear better words on the judgment day. And so will I. If we will allow ourselves the humility of a theological and not utilitarian approach to ministry. A utilitarian approach to ministry will work for a little while, but people will burn out, they'll quit. Churches will fail, programs will get canned, it will exhaust you. And if there's anything of your person left at the end of it, it will not be fun. You know what the best part of a theological approach to ministry is? It's a lot of fun. It's so free to come to a meeting. Yeah, I've got things to talk about, but you know what? I can easily set those aside because I don't need anything from you. I have everything I need because of God. It's full of joy.
Thank you for tuning into this episode of the podcast. Be sure to comment, like, and subscribe. Thank you so much for listening, and we will see you next week.